So tonight, our speaker is Tim Taylor, and he's an environmental scientist and a wildlife biologist who works with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And he was just telling me he's been here in this area doing this sort of work for
35 years.
35 years.
Wow, is that loud? Can I turn that down?
Ask him lots of questions about all of your burning wildlife issues, but it's really a pleasure to have Tim here. Thanks.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm privileged to be here tonight to talk to you about this subject because it's been something I've been kind of involved with for about, well, really 35 years, driving Highway 395 up and down, and I've encountered literally hundreds and hundreds of dead deer and other wildlife along the roadway throughout all of Mono County. And it's about time that we started thinking about actually remedying the problem, fixing the problem. And really, to date, not much has been done. There's been some signage that we've all seen, you know, flashing signs just right outside here. There's been a few attempts to route deer away from roadways, but really nothing's been done. And really throughout California, not a lot has been done. So we really need to try and get behind an effort here to get wildlife crossings or some way to get deer off of the roadway in Mono County. So I am an environmental scientist with California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I've been up here for 35 years, working for the department for about the last 20 years, doing mainly wildlife biology work, population monitoring. And I do spend a lot of time with migratory mule deer, sage grouse, and bears and other different species in Mono County. So just to say a little bit about roads, how do they impact wildlife? Well, it depends on where the road is. Of course, roads in rural areas don't have as much impact as roads that are adjacent to towns and urban areas, but they certainly cause habitat loss no matter where they're actually laid down, alteration just from pavement and grooming of roadside vegetation along the roadway. There's certainly diminished wildlife habitat. There's avoidance by some species because of traffic, so that can be an impact on breeding birds, especially a bird like a sage grouse that relies a lot not only on display but on acoustics to attract mates. Other songbirds, it can have an impact from high noise volumes associated with roads. And then roads also have the effect of improved habitat quality. So they can attract animals to the roadway, rodents, small mammals, other small mammals, snakes, and raptors that would actually be hunting those different species. And then that's going to exacerbate the roadkill problem. Coyotes, hunt a lot along roadways. We see them a lot when we're driving throughout Mono County, and we end up seeing those species dead on the roadway. And roads, other impacts are from barrier effects. So mainly reduced landscape connectivity, and that's just the ability for wildlife, the landscape to facilitate wildlife movements for a whole host of wildlife, and to also just allow for ecological flows. Increased direct mortality occur with the roadway. We often see, again, lots of dead deer on the road. A common thing here in Mono County. We definitely see other species, small rodents, rabbits, a lot of things that just disappear quickly, but the deer on the roadway, the bears on the roadway, those are the ones that persist, and we're most evident when we're driving. These mortality rates can lead to lower reproductive rates, lower population declines, and reduced population density by disrupting, of course, rates of gene flow. So wildlife vehicle collisions are a nationwide phenomenon. They happen all over the country. Reported wildlife vehicle collisions nationally are approximately 300,000. Really, there are a lot more than that, substantially more than that, but these are just the reported collisions based on some 2008 data from the Federal Highways Administration. And that's because, of course, databases don't always record all crashes, especially those that are under $1,000. I know not all drivers will report wildlife vehicle collisions. I know somebody that just hit a deer the other day, and instead of reporting it to their insurance, what did they do? They went and pounded out the dent themselves, and that's a common thing. So those things go unreported. Not all law enforcement and departments of transportation agencies record or have a good method of recording roadkill data. And then injured animals that are hit often leave the roadway and are not recorded. So in 2008, wildlife vehicle collisions accounted for about 5% of all reported motor vehicle collisions, which is substantial, and that's in the US nationally. So, and they're expensive, they're very expensive. So the estimated cost based on some 2008 data from Federal Highways was over $6,000 per accident. The cost includes property damage. Of course, there's human injuries and medical expenses associated with those collisions, and then there's human fatalities. And there are some reports out there in the literature that actually reported that over a million deer are hit nationally on roadways across the country, and those million deer actually cost over $1.1 billion in damages and resulted in 26,000 human injuries. The economic value of each deer has been looked at by certain municipalities and states to determine how much those deer actually cost to the town or the community that they're involved with, and over $2,000 per animal is what that value of that deer is, which is a high cost. And so when you add that in with the $6,000 associated with each accident, over and plus about $50 per deer for removal costs, it costs over $8,000 for each deer vehicle collision based on that 2000 data from Federal Highways Administration. In today's dollars, that's over $9,000 an accident. So getting on $10,000 an accident. So it's quite costly when there's a deer fatality that needs to be dealt with. So I kind of wanted to boil down and focus mainly on the Highway 395 corridor. I took a data set that was provided by Caltrans from 2014 to 2018. And just in that time frame, there were over 1,000 deer vehicle collisions that were recorded on Highway 395 in Mono County. And about 96% of those were mule deer. 3% were bear, and the rest were coyote, other miscellaneous species, raccoon, a beaver or two, skunks, those types of things. And that's because mainly deer persist on the highway for a long period of time. So do bears. The other carcasses of smaller animals, rodents, some of the smaller mustelids, those types of animals disappear quickly, and they go unrecorded. The data is provided by Caltrans maintenance staff. They're required to, when they pick up a roadkill, call it in to their dispatch in the Bishop office of Caltrans, and then that goes into a database. So a lot of deer, and a lot of animals, but a lot of deer were hit in that 4-year period. So it's about 956 deer that are actually recorded. Probably the number is 2 to 3 times that, even 5 times that, we just don't know, because again, animals leave the roadway or they're scavenged by humans or bears or whatever, and they just go unrecorded. So this is the best data we have. This is the reported data from Caltrans. And so because deer are the focal species that we see on the roads here that are crossing the roads, what we do for deer is going to help other animals in terms of maybe moving deer off, getting deer off the roadway, routing them off the roadway. It's going to help other animals as well from potentially being hit. So I want to focus this discussion on deer. It's what we see on the roadway. It is they are the most conspicuous, of course, and widespread animal in Mono County. We see them everywhere. There's lots of them right outside here on the moraines feeding. They move up here in the springtime and kind of stage outside of SNARL here and up towards Mammoth Lakes before they move over the mountains to west side summer ranges or further in the backcountry. We have 6 distinct mule deer herds. From south to north, that's Round Valley. We have the White Mountain herd over on the other side of the valley. Casa Diablo herd, which is out near Benton. And the Mono Lake herd, kind of up north of Mono Lake, that extends out on Winter Range towards Hawthorne. We have the East Walker herd just north of Bridgeport, and finally the West Walker herd, which is a big herd segment that's up by Coville and Walker. All these herds are migratory, except for White Mountains. I think they have some small migrations that they go through, but primarily the 5 big herds west of kind of that are along the Highway 390 kind of corridor are all migratory herds. And they migrate seasonally from Winter Range. That's in Nevada, so some of these herds are considered to be interstate herds, onto Transition Range, which is kind of, intermediate ranges like this elevation outside of Mammoth here, up around the Owens River, other places, Transition Range, which include holding areas or staging areas. We call them delay areas. Deer spend several weeks in those areas during the spring. And then there's also the summer ranges, which deer disperse to west side summer ranges or to further in the backcountry on the east side. The migration corridors consist of numerous migration routes, and lots of migration routes really will make up a migration corridor where deer concentrate their migration activity to get from one seasonal range to the next. For Round Valley, it's getting from Round Valley, which is down just north of Bishop, about 9 miles, up to the Mammoth area, or they can go south over Paiute Pass, and then to backcountry locations or to the west side. Same with Casa Diablo herd, Mono Lake herd, East Walker, and those migration routes typically are oriented along topographic features. So if you look at that map, you'll see that the migration routes for the Round Valley herd kind of follow the base of the eastern escarpment of the Sierra. Where Casa Diablo, they follow the base of the south slope of the Glass Mountains. Mono Lake Winter Range, they kind of orient their migration through the Bodie Hills. And the East Walker Winter Range along the kind of the east slope of the Sweetwater Mountains. West Walker, kind of a similar thing. So that's how they kind of orient their way. That's how those migration routes are taught from one fawn to from the adult doe down to the fawn from one generation to the next. And all Mono County herds, you could typically use these well-defined spring holding areas where deer concentrate in high numbers. Outside of Mammoth here, there's a holding area that we call the Sherwin holding area. And so deer move up out of Round Valley this time of year, and they'll spend from 6 to 10 weeks on that holding area while they forage on nutritious spring growth and kind of regain their body condition that's lost over the winter. And after that, they'll start making their way over the passes to the west side or further into the backcountry. And the alarming thing is that all these routes either come in contact or bisect Highway 395. And so this presents a serious problem for motorists and motorist safety. This map here was provided to me by Caltrans, and it displays hotspot areas along 395. So if you think back to that last map that showed the migration routes, these migration routes cross the highway, and where you see the warmer colors, those are where the hot spots or the most deer kill occur along Highway 395. And again, this is just based on the 2014 to 2018 data. And there's a hot spot north, let me see if I can get this thing working, north of Bridgeport right there. That's actually, we've seen a lot of roadkill in the last several years. There's one between the North and South Dune Lake Junction in here. It's that warmer color, that yellow. So that's what we call Sandhouse Hill. So if you're driving between Dune Lake and Levining, after you cross the South Dune Lake Junction, be real careful going through there in the spring and the fall, because there's probably going to be deer moving across through there. Plus there's some resident deer as well. And then there's this area, of course, right outside of SNARL here, from about McGee Creek on over to the Mammoth 203 junction. Those are the three main areas. There's lots of other areas where deer hit. There's one right by Conway, and there's some up here by Sonora Junction. And if you look at data from the last 20 years, there's going to be a lot more red spots within here. But again, this is just the best data that we have from about the last 4 years. And so this graph just kind of displays what I was talking about. The Mammoth Wildlife Crossing accounts for 33%, the Mammoth Wildlife Crossing area, which is the area from essentially, if I say post miles, it doesn't mean much to you guys, but from Highway 203 interchange on down to McGee, and then an area up Highway 203. But for that section of 395, 33% of all roadkill deer are were recorded from 2014 to 2018 in that, what I call the Mammoth Wildlife Crossing area. So that's only about 9% of the highway length in Mono County. So it's a very concentrated area of roadkill. And hence that's why there's been quite a bit of public outcry from a lot of private citizens. Certainly the local transportation committee was concerned about what they were hearing from local citizens about all the roadkill. I think most of you are sick of seeing dead deer on the roadway, and this explains why that's happening. They're very concentrated within this area in the spring and in the summer and in the fall. Deer move back down in the late fall and winter and are more in Round Valley, so the roadkill situation kind of mediates itself during that time of year, but once they come back, we see a big spike in roadkill numbers. Kind of drilling down closer to our area where we sit right now, here's SNARL, and you can see the red here from about McGee on up to Highway 203 interchange. Quite a bit of roadkill in here. Again, that area between the North and South Dune Lake Junction, Sandhouse Hill, you got to be careful in there, and then north of Levining. And this map really kind of explains what's happening. Deer are coming off of the Round Valley Winter Range here, and their migration route parallels the highway. So at some point, if you're a deer from Round Valley herd, you're probably going to come in contact with the highway. And if you're lucky enough, you won't get hit, but unfortunately many do. And so you could see where these hotspot locations are, where the migration paths really kind of intercept the highway. Not so much bisecting the highway, but they come awful close to the roadway. And there's a spot here where deer like to move back and forth because it's a natural terrain feature, and that's where they end up getting hit the most. Casa Diablo herd migrates mainly north of this area, but there are some animals that'll drift down into this project and get hit, and we'll see that later. Most of those deer go north and cross in that Soundhouse project that I was telling you about. And so here's kind of drilling down even more. The hotspots kind of spread out a little bit, and you can see we have 4 main hotspots. Mount Morrison Road. This is our main hotspot here, so Mount Morrison Road to Benton Crossing Road. You all know where that is. That's just right outside here, right outside SNARL. Like Carol was talking about, we see so many dead deer there. And just above McGee here, hotspot 2, around Hot Creek Hatchery Road, and then Mammoth Creek. This is a cool map that shows the migration of some collared deer that we actually captured and marked last spring. And we put some high fixed rate collars on them, 2 does, 2 adult females, to try to track their movements across the highway. We knew these deer were previously collared. We knew that they crossed the highway, but the collars that they had were only collars that recorded 1 position a day. So we recaptured those deer. We put on these high fixed rate collars that record up to 24 locations a day. And then we set up a geofence along the highway, which I think is about a half mile on either side. And when those deer enter that geofence, that's a virtual fence, so to speak, the number of downloads actually increases to about, I think every 20 minutes or so. So we can get some pretty good detailed information of these deer crossing the road. And so you can see that this deer, Round Valley 1, came up along the slope of the Sierra here and crossed at this hotspot at Mount Morrison Road. And this was just during a 24-hour period, so it went over and it came back. And we see a lot of deer doing that. Some make it, some don't. Similarly, this deer, Round Valley 5, crossed another hotspot up by Mammoth Creek. And so, we want to know where these deer cross and actually make it without getting hit. And so this is going to provide us some really interesting data. We actually put, I think, 11 or 12 of those collars on, and we plan to put probably another 50 to 60 on next spring. High fixed rate collars that can provide some really good information, not only from deer from Round Valley, but also deer from all the other herds, so we can get some really detailed information on where they're crossing the road. Here's some more data from deer that were fitted with GPS collars, but these are only 1 position a day. So this data was from, I think, 2014 to 2017. And these deer actually end up kind of living in this area. This CDB 077, a Casa Diablo deer, crossed the road a number of times, but finally she got hit and killed. These other deer, their fate was better. They made it, as far as we know. But you can see that animals will live right around the highway. They become accustomed to the traffic noise, and sometimes the forage conditions are better along highway, like I previously talked about, just because there's increased vegetation growth. When Caltrans blades the road or cuts some of the brush, it'll cause resprouting and cause release of some pretty good grasses and forbs, and so deer and other wildlife are attracted to the roadway. And they have to do that. Caltrans has to do that, try to open up visibility for motorists, but at the same time, it can cause deer to be attracted to the roadway. So this is just good, high-quality deer habitat, and deer are going to be living in there for as long as we're alive, and they're going to be going back and forth. And unless there's something put in place there, we're going to continue to see deer hit on the roadway. So this graph, I think, is really telling. I mean, it's the spring. It's the spring and into the summer that we see the majority of our roadkill occurring outside of Mammoth here. So this is that's post miles 16 to 27, about McGee on up to the Highway 203 junction, or a little bit further north than that. And so when you're driving in during May, right now, this month, you want to be very careful, because you got a chance that you're gonna strike a deer with your vehicle. Same for June, July, and August. All through the summer, there's summer resident deer that are hanging around, foraging in the right-of-way and moving back and forth across the roadway, and your odds of hitting a deer are still pretty good all the way through September, October. So these are not fixed in time or space, and not randomly fixed in time or space. It's really seasonality. And so deer are going to be in there in that area around Mammoth here during the spring, summer, and fall. As winter approaches, more snow hits the area, especially like a winter we had this year. That's going to drive most deer out of the area. In fact, all deer probably in a year like last winter, a winter like last winter. But some winters where it's more mild, we may see deer sticking around for the entire winter. And so really, you've got to be kind of conscientious of hitting an animal any time of the year. And I know many of you that live in Crowley or Bishop and move back and forth across or up and down the highway between, your jobs or whatever, are just probably always really worried about hitting an animal, especially at dusk or during the early morning hours. Or, even at night, obviously, just because the odds are there that, eventually going to hit a deer if you live in this county long enough. And so just kind of looking at some solutions to reduce collisions with wildlife. Of course, influencing driver behavior has been something that's tried because it's relatively inexpensive. So the driver warning signs that you see out on the highway these days, most people become unaccustomed to them, especially if you've been driving a lot up and down the highway. You probably don't even notice them anymore. I think they might work for tourists moving through maybe once or twice. They might become more vigilant as they're driving the road. But for most part, they're ignored. Same with, the messaging on the big CMS signs. And even animal detection systems, which are like infrared or some kind of Doppler radar that will advise people that there's maybe animals entering the roadway. Those have worked with mixed success and mainly on smaller two-lane highways. Influencing animal behavior, reducing, of course, animal or wildlife habitat adjacent to the roadway. And like I said, Caltrans does that regularly by mowing to not only increase driver visibility, but reducing some of the forage base along the road. And also trying to deter animals from the roads. And that's been done with reflectors hung on fences. The headlights will hit those reflectors and scare the animals away from the road. Those have worked with really kind of mixed success as well. There's been several papers really kind of that have determined that those methods don't work very well. So really the only thing that does work is keeping animals off of the road. And that's through enhancing existing structures, providing new structures like overcrossings and undercrossings, and then installing wildlife fencing to route animals to those different crossings. And so the types of wildlife crossings, of course, overcrossings. There's a really nice looking overcrossing in Banff right there. I mean, that's aesthetically pleasing, doesn't look too bad. Here's an undercrossing right here under a highway in Idaho, and that's just a simple box culvert. And then kind of a arched pipe culvert and run crossing in Banff. Wildlife undercrossing at a bridge, that includes fencing to route animals under the bridge. Here's a look at what wildlife fencing would look like. And many of you have come out of Reno, heading south back towards Carson City. You can really see along that new stretch some nice wildlife fencing that routes animals to some big bridge undercrossings. And that's the ideal situation for wildlife because they're open and wildlife are not hesitant to go under those big bridges. Unfortunately, we don't always have that capability just because we don't have the proper terrain features or whatever to build those types of structures. Here's some more examples of an undercrossing here. And then I think this was out of Wells, Nevada, another overcrossing for wildlife, for mainly mule deer, and I think maybe elk. So how do they work? The wildlife exclusion system, it's pretty simple. You've got the fence on both sides of the road, and that fence directs animals to underpasses or overpasses. So undercrossings or overcrossings. Now sometimes animals will get trapped within the right-of-way, and in order to deal with that and not have those animals hit, there are things called one-way gates or jump outs. This is a picture of a jump out of some mule deer coming off of the roadway where they got trapped. And so that lets them escape the roadway. So these exclusion systems are not 100%, but most of them, if they're constructed right and the amount of research is done to, the right amount of research is done to ensure that they're going to work, they're pretty much about 90 to 95% effective. And so again, do they work? So there's a Virginia case study where on Highway 64, I think out of Charlotte, deer vehicle collisions were the third most common crash type in that study area. So they added 21 miles of fence to 2 existing structures, an overcrossing and an undercrossing. And it was not a mitigation project. They, got the money together, installed the fence, and what they found was that they had 85% reduction in deer vehicle collisions. And this graphic actually demonstrates how effective it was. So pre-fencing, average of 7 deer vehicle collisions per year. Post-fencing, they had no deer vehicle collisions. And the amount of crossings detected by cameras actually increased for deer and other wildlife species. And that was for the overcrossing. For the box culvert, similar results. They had, average of 7 deer vehicle collisions per year. After that, just under 1. And the amount of wildlife crossings, so bears and other species, increased because of their ability to use these structures. So again, do they work? Well, the case study shows they work. Fencing for just one underpass had an expected savings associated with deer vehicle collisions of over $500,000. And so fencing and the undercrossings was effective when it found to be effective when it prevented 1 deer crash per mile per year. So it doesn't take much to get your money back. So the benefits of wildlife crossing structures, drastic reduction in wildlife vehicle collisions if it's constructed right. Increased motor safety, which is huge because we need to protect our motorists out there. Restored habitat connectivity and wildlife movement patterns. Of course, that's going to restore your wildlife populations when you stop having dead wildlife on the roadway. Restore genetic diversity because obviously you've restored your landscape connectivity, and reduce costs overall because of fewer insurance claims and vehicle repairs. So what I'm calling the Mammoth Wildlife Crossing, now we might end up calling it something else later, like the Long Valley Wildlife Crossing Project. Well, let's just call it the Mammoth Lakes Wildlife Crossing or Mammoth Wildlife Crossing Project for now. It's right now is constructed. It's a 4-lane designated scenic highway. It's got north and southbound lanes divided by a variable width median, and that is a median that can span from 46 feet to 100 feet in width. The average daily traffic is estimated about just over 7,000 cars to the junction of Highway 203 or State Route 203, and that's from some 2013 data. That was in the feasibility study report. There's some existing bridges, Mammoth Creek, of course there's the overpass that is at the junction, and then there's some big box culverts on Convict Creek, but there's not a lot of existing structures that can be used to get wildlife across a highway that we could build a crossing project into. And then the adjacent landowners are the federal agencies, BLM, Forest Service, of course, quite a bit of Los Angeles Department of Water Power land. Mono County has some land, and then there's some private parcels as well. And so back in the 60s, just for some background, Fish and Wildlife attempted to put out a little flyer that I think they handed out at like the bug station up north. And it advised people of where they had the highest potential of killing a deer, because my predecessor was very sick of seeing dead deer on the road. And it's interesting because all the locations are the same as I just showed you before from the roadkill hotspot data. And of course, there's an area right out here that they demonstrate as a hotspot just north of Crowley Lake. And that was an attempt to try to just get people to kind of wake up and pay attention when they're driving down the highway. It was pretty much ineffective because it ended up going in towards their campfire or whatever. Maybe helped a little bit. And then there was a fencing attempt in 1969 where Caltrans and I think Fish and Wildlife teamed together to build some deer-proof fencing that went from the 203 junction down to, I think it was about Sherwin Creek Road. And it was a 7-strand fence, about 7 feet high. And it was built to an attempt to try to get deer to move under Mammoth Creek crossing, under this overpass here. It was ineffective for the most part. I know they hung reflectors on it too to try to scare deer back from the roadway. I think that was ineffective. It just wasn't deer-proof enough. It just wasn't deer-proof enough, and deer were able to either squirt through the fence or, because it was 7 feet, jump over it. So those have really been the local attempts to kind of mitigate deer crossing in Mono County. So nothing's been done for quite a while, other than some seasonal signage things. So in 2016, Caltrans completed a feasibility study report, an FSR, and it evaluated the frequencies of deer and other wildlife vehicle collisions throughout their entire district, District 9, which includes a good portion of Inyo County and Mono County. They identified local areas with the highest concentrations of wildlife vehicle crossings, and that included Highway 395 and the Mammoth Wildlife Crossing. And that crossing, the Mammoth Wildlife Crossing, just outside of SNARL here, ended up being the area with the most roadkill, the most deer that were hit on the roadway. And so because of that, the engineer that I worked with developed 6 concepts in the feasibility study report to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions on 395 between those post miles there, between post mile 18 and 27, which is again from about McGee on up to just past Mammoth Junction, and then also on 203 for about 2 miles from the junction. And so this is the first concept, and remember, this is all conceptual. This is probably going to change drastically, but it's just to get some ideas flowing within their department, within kind of the public to kind of show what can be done out there. Of course, really constrained by topographic features here, and so that's kind of how the engineer had to plan. I mean, where are the creeks, where are the drainages, where are the low spots, where are any high spots that we could potentially build an overcrossing? And so this big concept, this is $53 million. This is the whole enchilada. This includes from McGee all the way up to past the 203 junction on 395 and then up 203. And this would include an overcrossing, large mammal overcrossing here on 203, another large mammal overcrossing just north of the airport, 18 miles of fence, of course, to route deer to these structures, a small mammal or a kind of a medium-sized mammal crossing between Mammoth Creek crossing here, which is existing and would be retrofitted to be more inviting to wildlife, deer and other wildlife to move through. And then two big crossings, undercrossings here, which would occur at Convict Creek, which would be new bridges. And then there's a big low spot, kind of the base of Morrison Hill, where we get quite a bit of roadkill, which would be a really good candidate for putting an undercrossing. So that's 18 miles of fence. That's where the expense comes with the fence. And of course, certainly these big overcrossing structures, those are very, very expensive. Concept 2 just involves 395 up to the junction. And like I said, these are conceptual. So we're probably going to see some variation of all of these down the road when we finally get to planning this out. But you could see we get rid of the idea of putting crossings on 203, which I don't know, based on the deer data, if it's totally necessary for us to do anything in 203. We might just want to spend our money on where we get the most roadkill. So again, retrofitting Mammoth Creek crossing, a medium-sized mammal crossing between Mammoth Creek and Hot Creek Road, another overcrossing just north of the airport and kind of the Hot Creek Hatchery Road, and then these two large undercrossings at the south end to take care of that hotspot. Concept 3 is much the same as Concept 2. It just would include an undercrossing here instead of a medium-sized, mammal-sized overcrossing. Overcrossings are more expensive than undercrossings, the way I understand it. But it would still have, 5 crossings to try to get animals across the highway. One thing here is it's just a real challenge because we've got this big stretch of airport where really nothing can be done except fence animals off and around the airport on both sides to these undercrossings. That's about 2 miles. That's a long way to push animals. The literature really is clear that we don't want to push animals between undercrossings for more than about a mile apart. And this is 2 miles, but it's all we're going to be able to do, really. And we do have quite a few deer vehicle collisions here adjacent to the airport. So we're going to have to push these animals to an overcrossing or an undercrossing to get them safely across the road. Concept 4 is, again, an abbreviated version that just goes from Benton Crossing Road on up to the Mammoth Creek Crossing. And so only an overcrossing, medium-sized mammal crossing, and then retrofitting the existing Mammoth Creek undercrossing. Concept 5 just really deals with this south end here. And this is the hotspot. So if money is coming slow and we can't get all the funding to do a bigger project, this is probably where we would start, quite frankly, because this is where the majority of the roadkill, if you remember the hotspot map, we would really try to focus on fencing animals to a new undercrossing on Morrison Hill, and then a new undercrossing on Mammoth Creek, or on Convict Creek, excuse me. The question is, what do you do if you bring fencing to here? What are deer going to do? Are they going to go around and be hit on this side? We don't know that, and so we need to do some studies to see how the airport and the other existing development is affecting wildlife distribution and movement patterns. And then concept 6 was kind of just the easy way out, just some seasonal signage, CMS here, potential message sign that flashes that deer are on the roadway during a certain time of the year, or here, or here. About 20,000 a year. So there were a number of concepts they considered but did not choose. And this, I'm talking about the Caltrans engineer, and that's wildlife detection systems, the Doppler radar and infrared that I talked about before. There was reliability issues, and they do sometimes become quite costly. There was electric fencing idea that was dismissed, and those can have all kinds of problems with, because the battery stops working or the batteries are stolen, deer are just going to jump over them, and they're not going to be effective. And then, like I talked about, reflectors and mirrors, they were tried along, this stretch of highway down to Sherwin Creek Road, and they really didn't work. And so, and the literature is kind of full of examples of those types of reflectors not working. And so here's kind of a conceptual rendering of what an overpass would look like. This would be just north of Hot Creek Road. And who is this? I don't know who this was drawn by. One of your engineers? Yeah. But it's, I think it's pretty cool. It would show, it kind of demonstrates how animals would cross over the highway north of Hot Creek there on an overpass. So you could still see Mammoth Mountain. You might lose sight of it for like 2 seconds, and oh my gosh, but what's more aesthetically pleasing, not seeing dead deer on the road, I think, is what I want to see. And then just kind of a cross-section elevational view. And so what are the challenges moving forward if we are going to undertake this project? Well, it's expensive, as you saw, up to $50 million. And so, we've got to find that money somewhere. And the highway's fully developed, so there's no new construction that's proposed for that stretch of highway. So you see, like up north, they're putting in new shoulders, 10-foot shoulders, widening, all those different things. They're not doing that here. And so you can't build any wildlife crossing mitigation into that highway and find funds for it, mitigation funds. Instead, we've got to go out and, I guess, beat the ground and try to get some entities to help fund this project. Federal highways, NGOs, whatever we can find to help, scrape enough money to at least get a start on that southern section. Another challenge is there's a lack of natural drainage features bisecting the roadway. And we got Mammoth Creek, we got Convict Creek, and everything else is pretty flat. If you go north in the county, there's lots of big drainages that bisect the highway. And it would be easy to put crossings in those, but we don't have that ability here. So we have to go over the highway with the overcrossing, like I showed in the conceptual design, that overcrossing north of Hot Creek Road. And those are expensive. The overcrossings are very expensive. So there's a long distances between potential crossing structures, which isn't the best thing, especially for smaller, less mobile wildlife. It's not even the best for deer, and so that's something we have to kind of address. There's existing facilities at the airport at 2 miles, and their potential fencing for security reasons. And then there's other existing development out there. There's a Mammoth Industrial Park. There's the old substation there near Mammoth Junction, Caltrans maintenance station. There's a number of existing developments out there that we have to deal with, and we have to determine how wildlife respond to those existing developments. And then there's always an increased human presence and public access needs. More and more people up here, more and more people recreating and expecting to have access to fishing and hiking areas and all that, which they should, but how do we deal with deer fence issues, wildlife-proof fence issues, and allow public access? That's going to be a real challenge. So some of the wildlife research needs, as I see it, for the Mammoth Wildlife Crossing is quantifying traffic-induced wildlife mortality across species, because we have good deer information, but we really don't have good information on other wildlife species, again, mainly because they get scavenged or they disappear. And Caltrans guys are out there, the maintenance staff, only in the morning, and they're not really recording a lot of those smaller wildlife species, so we want to try to get out there and record those. And then across habitats and seasons. Like I said, there's a certain seasonality that we're seeing with this roadkill pattern, and we want to be able to better document that information. And then we identify locations where animals cross the road successfully. Because if there are some places where the animals, with deer and other animals, are able to cross, we're going to know where those are, because maybe that's where we want to build our crossing structures into, not necessarily the areas where they're being hit on the road. That just tells us they're being hit there, but obviously a lot of them aren't making it. So maybe there's a spot that we can put a crossing that's going to be more friendly to wildlife passage. And then we want to evaluate wildlife use of existing crossing structures, the Mammoth Creek crossing, for instance, Convict Creek, and we want to focus not only on deer, again, on all wildlife species. You know, we want to focus on aquatic species. The other day we had a beaver that was hit just south of the Mammoth Wildlife Crossing, south of McGee. And so, you know, beaver will travel overland, they'll use waterways as well. Any aquatic species, we want to put cameras on those creeks and try to see what's using those different viaducts. And then we want to evaluate wildlife distribution and movement patterns in relation to the existing development. And that's Mammoth Yosemite Airport, the industrial park, Caltrans maintenance station, and that big highway 203, 395 interchange. How do animals respond to that? Is there an avoidance? Is it forcing them to move a different way across a different part of the highway? And so I'm sorry about these wordy slides, but you know, where are we now with all this? Recently there was a collaborative team that we're calling the Eastern Sierra Wildlife Stewardship Team. And that's a combination of both state, federal agencies, NGOs like the Cal Deer Association, private entities, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, a couple of local fish and wildlife commissions, town of Mammoth Lakes, the Land Trust. And, you know, our mission is to explore funding opportunities to support construction costs for the project. And we had our first meeting, I think, maybe it was about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago. And we kind of, you know, got introduced to each other and kind of set forth a plan on, you know, regular meetings, how we're going to, you know, attack exploring funding opportunities and those types of things. And also we want to provide not only some, I guess, advice on highway crossing structures in the Mammoth Wildlife Crossing area, but also along the whole Highway 395 corridor in Mono County. So kind of a landscape level approach to mitigation planning along the Highway 395 corridor, because we have a lot of concerns, not just down here, but as I showed you, all up and down the corridor. Cal Fish and Wildlife, the outfit that I worked for, recently received a grant from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a big game species conservation grant. We're going to take that funding and put that back into those high fixed rate collars. And those are going to be fitted to deer within all the different deer herds that I showed you on that map. So from Round Valley all the way up to West Walker. So from Bishop all the way to Coville, the state line. So that we can get that really site-specific, good, detailed deer crossing information on the highway. And then Caltrans has submitted an application for Prop 68, which is a habitat restoration grant, and they're waiting for the results of whether their application was accepted or not. So hopefully they did, and we're going to get some funding through that avenue. And Caltrans right now is planning to prepare a project initiation document, or a PID, and that just identifies the scope, cost, and schedule of the programming for transportation funds. And that will kind of, once they do that, that'll kind of, I think, identify this as a real project. Right now it's not a project, it's just really a conceptual idea that we're hoping becomes a project when Caltrans has their PID completed, and that's for about fall 2019. And then there'll be some, hopefully, partnering to complete the environmental phase between Fish and Wildlife doing a lot of the kind of wildlife assessment work, some of the biological studies, and then BLM has offered to potentially do some of the archaeological studies. And so there's always environmental concerns when you're constructing any type of project, whether it's really a kind of a mitigation project or anything else. there's environmental impacts and those have to be assessed. And, because there could be, wetland impacts, archaeological impacts, anything like that. And so I'd like to acknowledge a couple of people that helped me with some of the maps and some of the data. Katie Rodriguez from Caltrans and Stephen Filer from Caltrans, and then Kathleen Anderson from Fish and Wildlife, my outfit, helped with those beautiful maps. And if you have any questions, I'm available to answer them. Wow. Weyerhaeusen.
If I'm not mistaken, there was a pretty intensive study of the deer mortality along 395 30 some odd years ago, maybe mid-80s to early 80s, and you might have had some involvement and an attempt to actually find how many deer died away from the highway, even get the total.
That was just within a small section of highway between the North and South Dune Lake junctions. And that was by a consulting firm called Jones and Stokes Associates out of Sacramento that was hired by Caltrans to do that work. And so they had some perpendicular walking transects that went both east and west from the highway, and they did not encounter any deer that moved off the highway and died. So it was a statistically rigorous design study, but they did not find any deer that actually moved off the highway after being hit and died.
I had heard rumors of some horrendous numbers of deer killed, estimated to be killed every year in Mono County alone back then. Maybe that was better.
Yeah, back in the 80s, I think Ron Thomas had an estimate of about 700 per year, but there were a lot more deer in the county in those days. Yeah, upwards of 20,000. Now we have, population estimates for all those herds combined of about 12,000 animals.
Is there any indication that predators will learn to stake out these constructed crossings, maybe particularly in northern environments or at night? I mean, I can see them figuring out that the goodies come out of these tubes like a gumball machine, hanging out there.
Yeah, and I've heard of the same thing. And, I haven't really researched the literature on that, but I think the benefits of a crossing structure, getting those animals under the highway, well outweighs any potential predation risks. Yeah.
Balance, but I was curious as to whether or not particularly.
And it is a highway corridor. There is, quite a bit of human disturbance, and those types of predators sometimes, maybe other than bears, certainly lions probably don't want to be too close to the highway, I would think. But that's certainly a concern and something that we need to consider down the road.
So instead of us just being passive recipients of this information, what can we do as individuals? Drag on our state legislators? Or
There you go. Yeah. Provide input to your local transportation commission.
And as far as you're getting the data that you need, it sounds like you have a lot of stuff going back 3 years or more in terms of concepts, and I understand you need to do more. So how about your funding situation? Are you covered well for what you need to do? And what I'm worried about particularly is if we start running into recession, say next year, I could see things bogging down on this kind of project for another 5 years or more.
Yeah, even we had the money today for even that southern segment there from McGee up to, Benton Crossing Road, it probably wouldn't be constructed for another 4 to 5 years, Katie. It's just the way it is. These things are so slow in developing. And so I think right now the biggest thing is trying to get the ball rolling with regards to, like I talked about, that initiation document that Caltrans needs to develop, because that kind of, if I'm right, Katie designates it as a project, and right now it's not a project. We want to see it be a project, and then Caltrans can start their environmental studies, and so we have to get all those environmental studies out of the way, obviously, before we go to the next phase. And Katie, do you want to talk a little bit about I guess the scheduling of how these projects are.
Yeah, so I'm a senior biologist at Caltrans in Bishop. And so, yeah, as Tim mentioned, we have our PID document that we're working on, and that's just kind of our scoping document that determines the cost of the project, what needs to be done for the environmental phase, what are the potential impacts, because even though this is a kind of restoration and mitigation project, we could still have other resources out there that could be impacted. So we're hoping to get all that information by hopefully end of summer, early fall, and then that can kind of set a target for how much money do we need, what needs to be done, what are the timelines for these things to be done. And through our stewardship team, we're hoping that, with the help of some nonprofits that can go out and advocate for money, whereas, as state agencies, we can't go out to the public and ask for funding. So we're hoping that once we have that target kind of dollar amount and all the work that needs to be done and the timeline, that will help us, find ways to get funding, because it's really the funding that's holding it up. District 7, which is the Los Angeles Caltrans office, they actually have a wildlife crossing project as well over Highway 1 for mountain lions, and their project is fully funded, and it's fully funded by private donation. So obviously they have, Hollywood and other people with a lot of money down there, but I mean, we're a huge recreational place for people from that same area. So I think getting the word out and getting people to know the issue, and that really all we need to do it is funding, would definitely, hopefully get this project going. There's also potentially some movement in the state legislature to make this a requirement for Caltrans. We currently have a requirement kind of similarly for fish passage, where if we're ever doing a culvert project, we have to address fish passage, and that's usually something you deal with on the coast, but they could kind of have the same ruling for wildlife corridors and wildlife movement. And so, I work for Caltrans. We build lots of projects, but unfortunately we don't have a funding mechanism, particularly for these types of projects, even though they're very necessary, even for safety. So hopefully that can also kind of change. So yeah, voting, letting people know about the issue, and then when we get more information, we'll be asking for donations. So if you want to help out, that'd be awesome.
Jeannie.
What about partnerships with insurance companies? Because they are the ones. I mean,
Yeah.
has that ever happened in anything like?
Not that I'm aware of, but I haven't really researched that. But that's an idea, certainly, that we can try to track down. Yeah, that's a good idea.
I'll get on it.
Yeah.
I have a lot of experience with insurance.
I'm kind of maybe like a slightly different. I'm just curious in like urban planning, like when you're thinking about pedestrian deaths as a result of cars, it's often about slowing down the roadway. And I'm wondering if there's any research that you're planning on speed, like as it relates to speed restrictions, as a potential benefit, or is it just, maybe it doesn't matter nearly enough to make up for what you're describing. But I'm just curious about if there are other ways of designing roads that also kind of just can limit the danger for animals.
And definitely it's speed kills. I mean, the faster you're driving out there, the more apt you are to hit a deer or some other wildlife species. And I think we all know that. I think if we lived up here a long time and we drive this highway enough, we all tend to slow down because we know where the deer crossings are. We see enough dead deer on the road, and we just naturally slow down, I guess, unless we're in a real hurry. And so I think when that does occur, I think it does save wildlife. But in terms of implementing that into this road out here, let's say for the next 5 years until something's constructed, I don't know what the feasibility of that is. Do you know, Katie?
It's very difficult to change highway speeds currently, so I've asked about that before. I think, yeah, the most
April.
So I've heard that the underpasses are not quite as popular with deer as overpasses because of the predator-prey relationships. And so if that's true, is there a way to prioritize projects so that it's phased and we can fund, say, the most effective structure first and then build a bigger EIR that is
Yeah, we talked about that certainly, and that's probably realistically, I think, how things are going to happen. But unfortunately, for the Mammoth Wildlife Crossing, or Long Valley Wildlife Crossing, whatever Caltrans is going to calling it, we're really limited by topography constraints. And so down in that southern area around McGee and Morrison Hill, right outside of SNARL here, really, I think the only thing we're going to be able to do there, well, and I don't know this for sure because I'm not an engineer, maybe we can do an overcrossing there. But it looks like, the engineer thought that only undercrossings would be feasible there. And I think you're right. I think that, at times, depending on how undercrossings are constructed, deer and other wildlife can be hesitant to use those undercrossings. So there's kind of an openness ratio that they talk about. The more open the undercrossing, the more lighted it is, light coming in from the other side, the more apt animals are to use it, especially deer. Long tunnels, box culverts, they tend not to want to go through. And it's for that very reason they're afraid they're going to be subject to a predator. Yeah.
In your presentation, you mentioned some estimates about the cost of each collision, as far as per deer, as well as for the cars and the insurance and whatnot, damages and such, as well as injuries. And later in your presentation with the 6 concepts that you mentioned, have you looked into any cost-benefit analysis of how much effort is being put into each concept and the funding being put into, and how much of that, the cost per deer or per collision, might be removed as a rough estimate?
To my knowledge, no. Caltrans would be the ones that do that. And to my knowledge, you guys, your outfit has not done that yet.
We haven't done that yet, and there's also been some changes in the cost per animal and different things like that, and so we want to get some more up-to-date values for that, but yeah, we definitely want to look into that, because that's definitely makes a stronger argument for, the society as a whole. If they're spending all this money, why don't we spend that in preventing all of those collisions? So it definitely can, in a lot of cases, have a definite benefit for building those structures.
So I do want to let Tim off the hook here pretty soon and let him go, but perhaps he can entertain any other questions. But while everyone's still here, I just wanted to ask one question, maybe of Katie and Tim, about the process moving forward that may relate to that last question is, will there be some sort of public process to help decide upon which of the different concepts move forward? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, the environmental process is usually the process that involves the community, so I think we're already kind of anticipating this to be a higher level environmental document because of some of the impacts and also because of the community involvement. And so, yeah, usually in that process, pretty early on, we have community meetings that people can come and, give their comments or concerns, and those are really effective. We a lot of times incorporate that into our design or into our, how our environmental document will turn out. So, yeah, we usually do have several public engagements for that. We try and do a really good job of putting that information out there for people to come to, because I know this is a really important subject for a lot of people. So,
Yeah. Great, thanks. Well, I want to thank Tim for sure for coming tonight and educating us. Before I let him go, I just want to remind you all to drive safely on your way home. Now that you know where the hotspot is, it is right outside.
Right outside, yep.
Please drive safely, but thank you, Tim.
My pleasure, thank you.